Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the channel, The Territory of Cinema. Please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button if you enjoy our content. Today we are going to be discussing the 2013 film, A Good Day to Die Hard. The relentless pace of modern action cinema, that breathless rush of impossible stunts and barely plausible scenarios, finds a familiar, if slightly frayed, anchor in this continuation of the Die Hard saga. We open, as is often the case with the established John McClane, with him far from where he ought to be, this time finding himself in the neon-drenched, sprawling metropolis of Moscow. The setup is characteristically messy. McClane, the quintessential working-class New York cop perpetually out of his depth in foreign lands, is there searching for his estranged son, Jack. Jack, it turns out, is not just some wayward youth. He is, surprise of surprises, a CIA operative. This familial conflict, the grizzled veteran detective versus the highly trained, state-sanctioned operative, forms the core tension. Their relationship is clearly strained, burdened by years of distance and misunderstandings, a classic narrative shorthand for injecting emotional weight into explosive situations. Jack, whose career seems to have involved a great deal of shadowy intelligence work, is unexpectedly caught up in something far larger than a standard field operation. The immediate crisis erupts when a former high-ranking Russian official, Komarov, is being transported. Komarov possesses information vital to global security, information that a particularly ruthless faction of Russian power brokers desperately wants to silence. When the convoy transporting him comes under coordinated attack, Jack is forced to improvise, pulling McClane into the fray. This introduction of the elder McClane into his son's covert world is, naturally, met with extreme displeasure by Jack, who understands the protocols and the danger of having an unauthorized, unpredictable element, his father, involved. The subsequent action sequences reject subtlety in favor of sheer kinetic energy. We see massive vehicle chases through Moscow traffic, a sequence that pays homage to large-scale urban warfare films, but executed with the trademark, somewhat clumsy physicality McClane brings to every fight. McClane, whose career has always been defined by duct-taping improbable solutions together, views bureaucratic procedure as a suggestion, not a rule. His approach contrasts sharply with Jack's disciplined, often frustratingly controlled movements. Their initial cooperation is marked by mutual exasperation. McClane constantly undermines Jack's missions, often by sheer accident or by refusing to follow orders, a necessary evil, perhaps, for the audience who craves the familiar improvisational genius of the original films. Jack, meanwhile, is trying to extract Komarov while simultaneously dealing with betrayal from within his own agency contacts. The plot thickens as it's revealed that one of the seemingly helpful handlers is actually working for the main antagonist, a man named Sizranov, who is pulling the strings from behind the scenes, aiming to destabilize political relations by seizing the classified information Komarov holds. The action migrates from the crowded city streets to a massive industrial complex, where the stakes escalate beyond mere extraction. The fight becomes about preventing a massive data dump or misuse of intelligence that could trigger international incidents. There are moments where the father and son are forced, through necessity rather than choice, to synchronize their efforts. McClane's raw street smarts complement Jack's tactical training, leading to some surprisingly effective, if brutally efficient, teamwork. The climax takes place at an airport, a location that always signals a certain type of logistical chaos in action films. Here, the final confrontation with Sizranov and his heavily armed mercenaries unfolds. It's a showdown that tests both men's physical limits, with McClane finally proving to his son that while he may be old school and irritatingly loud, he is still very much a force to be reckoned with, capable of surviving impossible odds. In the aftermath, the immediate threat is neutralized. The resolution is not one of deep, heartfelt reconciliation, but rather a grudging acknowledgement between the two men. McClane has proven himself capable of operating in Jack's world, and Jack has perhaps learned that sometimes the only way to save the day is to let a little bit of glorious, controlled chaos, McClane's specialty, take over. They part ways, the rift slightly mended, with McClane likely heading back to New York, already anticipating the next inconvenient call that will drag him across the globe. The film concludes, leaving the audience with the familiar feeling of having witnessed necessary collateral damage enacted by a man who just wants to go home. McClane carries the weary gravitas of a man whose entire career has been a series of career-ending moments that somehow never ended his career, always relying on luck and sheer pig-headedness over proper procedure. Jack, whose career seems to have involved a great deal of shadowy intelligence work, mirroring the high-stakes globe-trotting inherent in spy thrillers, is unexpectedly caught up in something far larger than a standard field operation. He embodies the cold, calculated efficiency that his father inherently distrusts. The look of sheer exasperation that crosses Jack's face upon seeing his father emerge from the wreckage is priceless, a perfect encapsulation of their dynamic, unwanted help that is somehow always effective. His approach contrasts sharply with Jack's disciplined, often frustratingly controlled movements. Where Jack plans 3 steps ahead, McClane is already on step 7, having tripped over the first 6. Jack's dialogue is clipped, professional, utterly focused on the objective, which only seems to make McClane lean further into his characteristic rambling sarcasm. Sazranov represents the polished, modern villainy that views messy cops like McClane as mere statistical anomalies to be erased. In one instance, while Jack is setting up a complex breach, McClane simply drives a vehicle through the main obstacle, an act of brutal simplification that saves critical time but nearly gives Jack an aneurysm. It's a showdown that tests both men's physical limits, with McClane finally proving to his son that while he may be old school and irritatingly loud, he is still very much a force to be reckoned with, capable of surviving impossible odds through sheer, stubborn refusal to lie down. The emotional undercurrent here is McClane finally earning a sliver of respect from the son who viewed him as a liability. The film concludes, leaving the audience with the familiar feeling of having witnessed necessary collateral damage enacted by a man who just wants to go home, but who, deep down, is perpetually ready for the next fight. The inherent weariness that clings to John McClane, the kind that only comes from years of fighting impossible odds in inadequate footwear, is momentarily lifted by this fragile truce with his son. As they navigate the debris-strewn aftermath of the airport confrontation, the sense is less of a warm family reunion and more of 2 highly competent soldiers acknowledging a successful, if unwanted, joint operation. Jack, shedding the rigidity of his CIA training just enough to allow a flicker of filial relief, manages a tight, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude toward his father, a gesture far more meaningful than any grand speech in their stunted vocabulary. McClane, ever the master of deflection, responds not with sentimentality, but with a characteristic jab about Jack's choice of profession, perhaps noting the irony of a spy son being utterly undone by an analog cop father. Their separation is swift, mirroring the detached nature of their reacquaintance. There are no long goodbyes. In the world of clandestine operations and off-the-books heroism, lingering emotional moments are simply invitations for the next wave of villains. McClane finds himself, as always, looking for the quickest route back to American soil, away from the labyrinthine politics and chillingly cold efficiency of the Russian landscape. He carries with him a renewed, if complicated, understanding of his son's life, a world built on secrets and necessary violence that mirrors his own, but is executed with far more expensive equipment. The narrative gracefully steps away from the immediate fallout, the massive international incident averted thanks to their chaotic intervention, allowing the focus to return to the core identity of the franchise. John McClane is not designed for quiet retirement or domestic bliss. He is an agent of disruption, a necessary wrench thrown into the perfectly oiled machinery of global espionage. The film suggests that while Jack might find a place within the established systems, John will forever remain outside them, an eternal, stubborn anomaly. The final moments carry the familiar resonance of a John McClane adventure drawing to a close. The roar of a departing engine, perhaps an airplane taking the cynical operative back to the familiar grid of New York City, and the implicit promise that the world is too messy, too prone to sudden catastrophic failure for a man like him to ever truly settle down. He has survived another impossibility, another city, another generation of antagonists, leaving behind a trail of structural damage and a slightly better relationship with his son. It is a victory measured not in accolades, but in the simple, visceral fact that he made it through, ready, or perhaps reluctantly resigned, to the next call that will inevitably drag him, against his better judgment, back into the line of fire. The enduring appeal lies in that stubborn refusal to adapt to a world that demands professionalism when all it really needs, occasionally, is a very loud, very persistent American cop. He sees in Jack the potential for true effectiveness, tempered by the soul-crushing compromises of institutional loyalty, a trap John himself has always skillfully avoided by remaining officially inconvenient. He realizes that Jack, despite his training echoing the disciplined precision seen in high-budget espionage films, is still fundamentally drawn to the messy, boots-on-the-ground problem-solving that defines the McClane legacy, even if Jack tries desperately to mask it with jargon and tactical restraint. His career, built on being the outsider who succeeds where professionals fail, demands this perpetual state of unwanted arrival and necessary departure. The enduring appeal lies in that stubborn refusal to adapt to a world that demands professionalism when all it really needs, occasionally, is a very loud, very persistent American cop who understands that sometimes the only clean way to resolve a mess is to make a bigger one first. As McClane boards the transport, the exhaustion visible in the slump of his shoulders is profound, yet underneath it simmers the familiar, restless energy. He's seen the glossy veneer of covert operations up close and found it ultimately lacking the satisfying, tangible mess of street-level police work. He glances back toward the airfield, catching a glimpse of Jack still coordinating the cleanup, a figure of controlled competence, a man who operates by the book even when the book has been set on fire. There is a shared recognition in that final look. They are both fundamentally incapable of walking away from chaos once they've smelled it. McClane pulls a slightly mangled pack of cigarettes from a pocket, ignoring whatever health warnings he's accumulated over the decades. This small act of vice is his declaration of independence from the pristine world of agency directives. He reflects on Komarov, the central figure whose secrets nearly brought down governments. For McClane, such high-stakes political maneuvering feels abstract, less real than the immediate sensation of a fist connecting or the smell of aviation fuel. His heroism has always been intensely personal and localized, a reaction to immediate threats against innocent bystanders, not grand geopolitical strategies. The journey back is likely to be filled with the monotonous drone of travel, a stark contrast to the cacophony he leaves behind. He anticipates the familiar, slightly nagging feeling of being out of sync with his usual environment. In Moscow, he was the odd man out. Back in New York, he will be the man who just returned from saving Eastern Europe, and no one will care except perhaps his daughter. The emotional distance with Jack remains vast, a chasm bridged only by shared gunfire. McClane understands that his son chose this life not necessarily out of ambition, but perhaps out of a desperate need to be significant in a way that McClane's localized actions never seem to be. Yet John also knows that Jack's polished exterior can shatter under pressure, revealing the same raw, reactive core that has defined his father's entire career. This entire excursion serves as a momentary realignment of the McClane family dynamic, a strange sort of shared trauma that momentarily forces them onto the same frequency. For John, the victory is proving that the old ways still work, even when faced with the sleek, modern threats favored by the new generation of villains like Sizranov, who operate with spreadsheets and encrypted communications. McClane's tools remain brute force, tenacity, and an intuitive grasp of human weakness. As the plane ascends, leaving the sprawling, dangerous beauty of Moscow behind, John McClane settles in, already mentally preparing his cover story for his superiors. A story that will inevitably be a gross understatement of the reality, because in his world, the less said about how the job got done, the better. He closes his eyes, not to rest, but to anticipate the next time the world decides it needs saving by a man who truly doesn't want to be there. The return journey is characterized by a profound, almost meditative silence within McClane, a stark contrast to the explosive noise that usually soundtracks his existence. Settling into the cramped confines of the airplane seat, the dull ache in his joints seems to confirm his status as an artifact of a bygone era of law enforcement. He observes the other passengers, people engrossed in mundane travel magazines or sleeping peacefully, utterly unaware of the geopolitical razor's edge. They narrowly avoided stepping onto thanks to a couple of McClanes causing mayhem in Russia. This detachment is his default setting, the guardian who can never truly join the society he protects. He contemplates Jack's career trajectory. Jack embodies the modern operative, trained to see the world in clean lines of intelligence data and calculated risk, very much influenced by the sleek, emotionally sterile nature of contemporary spy thrillers that prioritize technological superiority over visceral survival. John, whose career was forged in the crucible of sweaty basements and broken elevator shafts, feels a strange mix of pride and melancholy. His son achieved the level of operational relevance John always sought, yet he achieved it by stepping away from the straightforward, albeit messy, duty of a beat cop. McClane respects the skill but misses the accessibility. Jack's world is too shrouded in clearance levels and compartmented information for a man whose signature move involves shouting very loudly in an empty building. As the plane crosses into different time zones, McClane's mind drifts back to the airport hangar, the final desperate stand. It wasn't just about stopping Sizranov. It was about the kinetic language he finally shared with Jack. When Jack was about to be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, McClane didn't offer tactical advice. He delivered pure, unadulterated physical mayhem, a sudden injection of the unpredictable into the enemy's formation. That moment, where their actions finally aligned without argument, suggests that the DNA of survival overrides years of strained communication. It's the ultimate testament to their shared inheritance, an unyielding capacity to endure when all logic dictates surrender. The airplane door opening onto the familiar, slightly smoggy air of a U.S. airport doesn't bring relief, but a return to the starting line. McClane collects his meager belongings, already bracing himself for the bureaucratic inquest that will inevitably follow his unauthorized detour abroad. He knows the report will be sanitized, his actions justified with vague references to intelligence sharing, the real story buried under mountains of paperwork that he will never read. He steps off the plane, a man who has just dismantled an international conspiracy, walking anonymously among travelers concerned with lost luggage. He leaves the airport perimeter, the roar of traffic replacing the roar of fighter jets. The concluding thought, the one that anchors him to his bizarre existence, is simple. The system, whether it's the NYPD or the CIA, always needs someone willing to get their hands irrevocably dirty. And as long as there are shadowy figures like Komarov holding secrets, or ruthless operators like Sizranov attempting to exploit them, John McClane will always be just one inconvenient phone call away from being dragged, reluctantly and noisily, back into the fray. He walks toward the exit, already looking slightly out of place, already waiting for the next disaster to call him by name. He doesn't read, he watches, cataloging exit routes and potential threats, a habit deeply ingrained from his years of patrolling streets where every shadow held a possible adversary. John recognizes the isolation in Jack's disciplined life. It's a lonelier kind of duty than the community-focused chaos of the NYPD. McClane recalls the brief moment where Jack abandoned protocol to trust his father's gut instinct, a concession that meant more to John than any victory celebration. His trademark white undershirt, now likely torn and slightly scorched, remains his uniform, impervious to foreign locales or federal oversight. He walks toward the exit, a ghost moving through the mundane routines of everyday life, already looking slightly out of place, already waiting for the next disaster to call him by name, because for John McClane, survival isn't an achievement, it's just the brief pause before the next unavoidable fight. The transition from the high-octane tension of international espionage back to the banality of American airport security is jarring, but John McClane navigates it with the practiced nonchalance of a man who knows he looks like he just walked out of a war zone because, effectively, he did. The slight limp is more pronounced now, not just from combat damage but from the sheer weight of obligation that seems to follow him across continents. He bypasses the luggage carousel with practiced ease, having learned long ago that checking baggage is an invitation for unwanted scrutiny. As he hails a cab, a necessary concession to convenience after days of vehicular mayhem, McClane allows a rare small smile. It's not joy, but rather the grim satisfaction of having done something fundamentally right in a world populated by compromised operators and political schemers. His son Jack, despite his stringent training, proved he had the necessary McClane stubbornness buried beneath the surface. That small concession Jack made during the final shootout, an instinctive move based on his father's improvised distraction rather than pre-approved tactical doctrine, speaks volumes. It suggests that the spirit of disruption, the very thing that has kept John alive in every die-hard scenario, is generational. He ignores the incessant buzzing of his phone, knowing any call now will be official noise, debriefings, paperwork, reprimands wrapped in praise. His focus is internal, the quiet, internal cataloging of damage sustained and lessons learned. He realizes that Jack's life as a CIA agent, while seemingly more glamorous than a New York City detective's beat, is ultimately more restrictive. Jack is bound by allegiances. John is bound only by the immediate threat to life. This fundamental difference in professional ethos is why their relationship is so fractured, yet why they were so effective together. They canceled each other out, creating a momentary perfect equilibrium of chaos and control. Driving through the familiar cityscape, the skyscrapers seem less imposing than the jagged concrete structures of Moscow. There is a sense of homecoming, but it's the homecoming of a battle-hardened veteran returning to a town that has forgotten the war he just fought. McClane's career has been defined by these episodic reappearances, a necessary emergency brake pulled only when the crisis reaches a critical, world-ending pitch. He is the ultimate deterrent, the last line of defense that nobody wants to activate because activating him means admitting utter failure on the part of established authority. As the cab pulls up to a nondescript address, perhaps a friend's house or a temporary rental, the film leaves him on the precipice of the mundane. He pays the driver, steps onto the sidewalk, and the noise of the city washes over him. The audience is left with the understanding that John McClane's heroism is inherently temporary. He saves the day not for glory or promotion, but to earn a few quiet days before the next call, the next impossible destination, the next time fate decides to drop a highly volatile situation directly onto his lap. His legacy isn't built on trophies, but on the simple, unyielding fact that he always, somehow, manages to crawl out of the wreckage, ready to do it all over again. The familiar smell of exhaust fumes and stale city air acts as an unexpected balm to McClane's senses after the sterile, high-tech environment of the Russian operations. He pays the cab driver in crumpled bills, a tangible exchange that feels more honest than any digital transfer he witnessed in Moscow. Stepping onto the pavement, the weight of his isolation settles back upon him. He is a man who just shared a life-or-death experience with his only son, yet he is entirely alone in processing it. The emotional residue of the adventure, the mutual reliance, the fleeting moments of understanding is already beginning to dissipate, replaced by the practical logistics of recovery and evasion of official inquiries. He walks with a slight swagger that belies the bruises accumulating under his clothing, an unconscious performance of invincibility he maintains for the outside world. John knows that if he ever stops projecting that image, the indestructible, wisecracking cop, the veneer of his entire existence might crack. His inspiration, if one can call it that, is rooted in a deep, almost perverse commitment to the common man. He fights because the people in suits are either incompetent or compromised. His career narrative is not one of rising through the ranks, but of constantly resisting the urge to be promoted into irrelevance. Inside the quiet anonymity of his temporary lodging, the adrenaline finally begins its slow, painful retreat. He tends to his wounds with the practiced efficiency of a man who owns a well-stocked emergency first aid kit, filled mostly with duct tape and aspirin. It is during these solitary moments that the consequences of his actions truly register, not the international fallout, but the personal toll. He wonders if Jack will call, not with a tactical update, but with something resembling real connection. Yet he doubts it. Jack's world demands professional distance, a necessary cruelty that John himself inflicted, albeit unintentionally over the years. The narrative closes not with a bang, but with the quiet implication of inevitability. McClane doesn't seek out trouble. Trouble, recognizing a reliable host, simply seeks him out. He might spend a few days trying to engage in normalcy, maybe catch a Mets game or argue with his ex-wife, but the underlying tension never truly leaves. He is the cinematic equivalent of a recurring natural disaster, temporarily dormant but always capable of resurfacing when the structural integrity of global stability is threatened. The faint sound of a siren in the distance, even one unrelated to him, is enough to cause a momentary tightening in his posture. He has survived this day, this mission, this strained reconciliation. But the enduring truth of the die-hard universe is that for John McClane, the hardest part of the job is always the going home, because home is only ever a brief intermission before the next curtain call. He recognizes that the bond forged in chaos is temporary, a situational utility that neither of them is equipped to maintain under peacetime conditions. McClane walks with a slight swagger that belies the bruises accumulating under his clothing, an unconscious performance of invincibility he maintains for the outside world. He views his role less as heroic and more as necessary maintenance. He cleans up the messes that bureaucracy and hubris create. Yet he doubts it. Jack's world demands professional distance, a necessary cruelty that John himself inflicted, albeit unintentionally, over the years, by prioritizing the immediate crisis over domestic stability. John sees in Jack the potential for a cleaner version of his own heroism, but fears that clean path leads only to emptiness. The narrative concludes by solidifying McClane's permanent outsider status. He is the perennial tourist of disaster zones. The faint sound of a siren in the distance, even one unrelated to him, is enough to cause a momentary tightening in his posture, a reflex that will never fade. But the enduring truth of the die-hard universe is that for John McClane, the hardest part of the job is always the going home, because home is only ever a brief intermission before the next curtain call, signaled by a ringing phone promising yet another impossibly loud day in a foreign land. The apartment he finds is predictably sparse, reflecting the transient nature of a life spent chasing explosions across time zones. McClane moves through the rooms with an almost ghost-like familiarity, stripping off the remnants of his travel-worn clothes, the sweat, the grit, the faint metallic scent of recent gunfire clinging to the fabric. He doesn't unpack. There's no point in settling in too deeply. He showers, letting the hot water scour away the residue of Moscow's grime, but he knows the internal residue, the memory of seeing Jack operate under duress, will take far longer to wash out. He finally picks up the phone, not to call anyone official, but to dial a number he hasn't used in months, fully expecting a recorded message or an unanswered ring. The fact that his daughter, Lucy, eventually picks up is a small, unexpected victory in itself. Her voice is cautious, conditioned by years of knowing when her father calls, it usually means something has violently broken somewhere far away. McClane doesn't launch into war stories. He offers a weak, practiced apology about being out of touch, skirting the truth about the international kidnapping plot and vehicular demolition. Lucy, having experienced his brand of disruption firsthand in earlier installments, perceives the evasion. She doesn't press. Their conversation is brief, clipped, yet layered with unspoken history. The cost of being John McClane's family. It's a fragile connection, but it's the anchor he always seeks when he's orbiting chaos. He finds himself staring out the window at the familiar, indifferent city skyline. His career inspiration has always been purely reactive: confront the immediate threat, protect the innocent bystander, and leave the politicians to clean up the mess later. This philosophy stands in direct contrast to Jack's existence, which seems predicated on avoiding the mess entirely through perfect preemption. Yet Moscow proved that when the high-tech systems fail, when the carefully constructed protocols collapse, it's the raw, instinctual fight, the McClane specialty, that saves the day. As the silence stretches, John allows himself a moment of quiet consideration for his son. Jack is undoubtedly skilled, molded into a weapon by the intelligence apparatus, but McClane realizes that his son, in the final moments, chose connection over protocol. He didn't just survive, he fought alongside his father, acknowledging the shared blood and shared, brutal understanding of necessary force. This subtle shift in Jack's rigid demeanor is the true resolution of the film for John, more significant than any successful data retrieval. He pours himself a lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. He knows the intelligence community will sweep the incident under a rug large enough to cover Eastern Europe, and he will likely be officially grounded for 6 months. But John doesn't care about official sanction. He cares about the next time he hears the right kind of distress signal. He leans back, not relaxed, but coiled, knowing that the relative quiet he currently enjoys is merely the calm before the next global storm finds its reluctant, white undershirted hero. The cycle is complete, and the anticipation of its inevitable resumption is already beginning to settle in his bones. The 2013 installment, A Good Day to Die Hard, offers a stark, somewhat deflating continuation of the John McClane saga, finding the aging action hero transplanted from familiar New York grit to the cold, technologically charged backdrop of Moscow. This film attempts to reignite the franchise by focusing on a strained father-son dynamic, positioning Bruce Willis's street-smart, cynical cop opposite Justin Long's character, Jack, who is revealed to be a covert CIA operative. This narrative choice immediately positions the film within the trope of the reluctant mentor forced into an uneasy alliance with a younger, ostensibly more polished professional. Willis, by this stage in his career, embodied a weary resilience. Having successfully anchored the Die Hard series by making McClane the ultimate blue-collar outsider fighting improbable odds, his presence here leans heavily on established audience affection rather than genuine dramatic evolution. McClane's character remains stubbornly analog in a digital world, a key source of the franchise's charm, yet here it feels increasingly repetitive. His arrival in Moscow is motivated by retrieving his estranged son, a plot device designed to force emotional proximity amid escalating mayhem. Justin Long, known for roles balancing vulnerability and intelligence in films like Galaxy Quest and Jeepers Creepers, struggles somewhat to establish the necessary friction with Willis. His Jack is competent, but lacks the discernible flaw or palpable desperation that made McClane so relatable. Their dynamic centered on Jack's secrecy regarding his government work, a secret John immediately despises because it mirrors the emotional distance he himself cultivated, serves as the thin connective tissue holding together the explosion-heavy set pieces. The action sequences, choreographed by director John Moore, director of Max Payne and Behind Enemy Lines, prioritize sheer scale and vehicular chaos over the intricate, puzzle-like suspense that defined the original Die Hard. more favors broad spectacle, a daring escape from a high-rise building involving multiple vehicles tumbling down scaffolding and prolonged sequences of vehicular warfare through the streets of Moscow. While undeniably loud and visually impressive in their destruction, these moments often feel weightless. The camera work, kinetic to the point of disorientation, sometimes obscures the spatial logic of the fights, leaving the audience observing carnage rather than participating in McClane's struggle for survival. The film seems to have taken the lesson from previous sequels that more explosions equal better stakes to an unsustainable extreme. The central conflict revolves around a MacGuffin involving a corrupt Russian official, Komarov, and stolen documents related to a nuclear materials deal. This plot is less a driving force than a convenient justification for the pervasive destruction. Unlike Hans Gruber, whose intellect and cool demeanor provided a perfect foil for McClane's improvised defense, the villains in this installment are largely interchangeable agents of chaos, lacking memorable dialogue or strategic depth. They are primarily there to be outmaneuvered by McClane's sheer stubborn refusal to adhere to safety protocols. A critical failure lies in the diminished sense of place. While the first Die Hard was inextricably linked to Nakatomi Plaza, its contained environment, and the second to the claustrophobia of an airport, Moscow feels entirely generic. It is a playground of interchangeable concrete and glass towers utilized purely as targets for ballistic damage, offering little of the specific cultural texture that could have provided a unique challenge for the outsider McClane. Ultimately, A Good Day to Die Hard functions less as an organic extension of the McClane narrative and more as a high-octane cash-in, striving to replicate the impossible chemistry of its predecessors with only the surface elements, the wisecracks and the broken bones, remaining. It trades narrative ingenuity for kinetic overload, leaving the viewer with a sense of exhausted spectacle rather than genuine satisfaction regarding the fate of the McClane family. The film's insistence on the father-son conflict, while thematically rich on paper, the grizzled veteran confronting the legacy he fostered through absence, never quite lands emotionally. McClane's abrasive approach to Jack's CIA mission stems from a lifetime of operational secrecy breeding personal isolation. We see glimpses of the regret Willis perfected in quieter moments of previous installments, but here, that vulnerability is swiftly drowned out by the next incoming barrage of gunfire. Jack, as the CIA agent, is supposed to represent the polished, government-sanctioned version of the protector John could never be, yet the performance lacks the necessary spark to make their forced teamwork compelling. Long often seems to be reacting to the chaos rather than actively driving the plot alongside his father, which undermines the supposed parity in their action roles. The set pieces, rather than serving the story, feel like elaborate video game levels designed purely for demolition. Consider the sequence involving the convoy attack on the highway. It is an extended showcase of vehicular destruction that completely sacrifices the grounded physicality that defined McClane's original encounters. In Die Hard, McClane was often severely disadvantaged, using his wits to turn the environment against the enemy. Here, both father and son seem inexplicably skilled at commandeering heavy military hardware with immediate proficiency, erasing the underdog quality that is McClane's very essence. This lack of struggle dulls the impact of their eventual victories. Furthermore, the emotional undercurrent concerning Jack's professional life, his betrayal of trust by working for the government, a job John implicitly disapproves of because it mirrors the emotional distance John created, is resolved too easily. A meaningful exploration of their broken bond would require moments of quiet tension, perhaps a scene where John has to choose between saving the mission and saving his son, mirroring his choices in previous films. Instead, these moments are rushed through to transition back to the next destructive set piece, suggesting that the screenplay prioritized the explosion count over character consequence. The film's villain structure also contributes to this sense of hollowness. Komarov is less a nemesis and more a high-stakes errand runner. He lacks the memorable, quotable menace of a Gruber or the methodical madness of a Simon. The entire concept of the stolen nuclear materials feels derivative, a recycled threat designed to raise the stakes externally without deepening the internal conflict between father and son. When McClane finally confronts the main antagonist, the payoff feels less like the climax of a personal war and more like the conclusion of a very expensive video game level. The inherent joy of watching McClane overcome insurmountable odds is replaced by a mild obligation to watch him simply survive another spectacular sequence, leaving the audience admiring the pyrotechnics rather than investing in the man underneath the soot. The film ultimately suffocates the very qualities that made its protagonist an enduring icon. The film struggles profoundly in translating the inherent chemistry of the die-hard template into this new context. John McClane's appeal always rested on his accessibility. He was the everyman thrust into extraordinary circumstances, nursing an injury while delivering a perfectly timed, sarcastic retort. Willis, while capable of delivering the requisite one-liners, often appears too powerful, too insulated by the escalating budget of the set pieces to truly feel vulnerable. His fatigue reads less like the genuine weariness of a man who has seen too much, and more like the professional obligation of an actor fulfilling a contractual obligation to perform stunts. The grit of his New York origins feels completely scrubbed away by the polished, sterile environments of global espionage in Moscow. Justin Long's Jack, meant to be the narrative counterpoint, carries the burden of being the CIA prodigy, a role that automatically distances him from the blue-collar heroism of his father. In theory, this opposition, the government operative versus the rogue cop, should fuel dynamic conflict. In execution, however, their disagreements seem superficial, immediately shelved whenever the next explosion mandates cooperation. The film never allows the audience to sit in the discomfort of their estrangement long enough for the forced reconciliation to carry emotional weight. There is no moment where Jack truly questions the morality of his covert operations in a way that John might respect, nor is there a moment where John truly accepts that his son's world requires the very secrecy John despises. It's a relationship shorthand, not an earned dramatic progression. The action choreography under Moore consistently favors spectacle over logic, creating a pervasive sense of weightlessness. When McClane and Jack survive an entire sequence involving a massive fall from a skyscraper, where they transition from a falling vehicle to a second falling vehicle, the audience's suspension of disbelief is stretched thin to the breaking point. This isn't resilience, it's invincibility bordering on cartoonish. The foundational tension of earlier films derived from McClane having to think his way out of a trap using limited resources, a phone, a broken radio, or a ventilation shaft. Here, the resources are limitless military hardware and the structural integrity of every nearby building. When McClane famously states, "I'm on vacation, I'm not looking for trouble," it rings hollow, as the trouble seems entirely manufactured by the screenwriter's imperative to level city blocks. The narrative mechanism involving Komarov and the stolen files is so flimsy that it fails to anchor the chaos. Good action cinema villains provide psychological opposition. Gruber challenged John's moral compass. Simon challenged his familial ties. Komarov, conversely, exists only as the necessary catalyst for destruction. The film uses the threat of nuclear contamination as a ticking clock, a device often employed when character development stalls. The stakes become purely quantitative, how many people will die, rather than qualitative, how will this event fundamentally change John McClane? By the film's conclusion, the attempted emotional beat concerning the father and son finding common ground feels entirely unearned. They have merely survived a series of unbelievably destructive events side by side. The final moments suggest a tentative truce, but the foundation for that truce, mutual understanding or respect, was never genuinely established amidst the pyrotechnics. A Good Day to Die Hard functions as a testament to diminishing returns, demonstrating that the essential spirit of John McClane, the reluctant hero finding triumph in improbable defense, cannot be sustained merely by increasing the volume and scale of collateral damage. The stylistic dilution of the Die Hard formula is perhaps most acutely felt in the film's failure to utilize its international setting effectively, moving the action from a singular, architecturally interesting location, like the claustrophobic confines of Nakatomi Plaza or the logistical nightmare of Dulles Airport, to the sprawling, largely undifferentiated urban landscape of Moscow strips the environment of narrative utility. The city becomes a vast, expensive set rather than a character in the conflict. We are shown grand vistas and massive concrete structures, but these locations are treated purely as interactive backdrops for vehicular stunts, lacking the specific geography that John McClane traditionally exploits. He is no longer disarming a bomb in a precise location. He is simply fighting in a large, expensive sandbox. This generic quality extends to the film's pacing, which barrels forward with an almost panicked energy, never allowing the audience to feel the oppressive tension of a real siege. The structure leans heavily on constant, escalating activity, a characteristic often found in sequels desperate to prove they are bigger than their predecessors. Director Moore, whose previous work demonstrated a facility with taut military action, here seems overly reliant on digital effects to carry the narrative weight. When McClane and Jack commandeer a fighter jet for a relatively brief sequence, the spectacle feels both out of character for the grounded survivalist nature of McClane and totally disconnected from the original film's ethos, where improvisation with whatever lay at hand was key. The jet sequence, while visually grand, signifies the point where the series definitively prioritized blockbuster excess over believable consequence. Furthermore, the attempts at injecting humor often feel inorganic. McClane's quips, once sharp barbs aimed at deflating the arrogance of his adversaries, here sound more like punchlines delivered to an empty room. The banter with Jack is frequently interrupted by explosions, suggesting the script itself lacks faith in the dialogue to sustain interest. The relationship is defined by forced understanding rather than organically earned mutual respect. When John finally addresses Jack's professional life with a modicum of acceptance, it arrives not after a moment of shared vulnerability or a difficult moral compromise, but immediately following a particularly destructive car chase, making the resolution feel like a necessary narrative beat to tick off before the final act, rather than a meaningful character shift. The result is a film that honors the visual iconography of the Die Hard brand, the white tank top, the heavy arsenal, the running and jumping, but completely misses the internal logic. It functions as an exercise in replicating the surface energy of action cinema without understanding that the core appeal of John McClane was his profound resistance to the very excesses this film celebrates. He was the relatable man enduring the inhuman situation. Here, he is just another highly skilled operative enduring an extremely expensive video game, albeit one with a famous, weary voiceover. The film ultimately leaves the viewer exhausted, not thrilled, by the sheer kinetic output. The absence of a truly compelling antagonist is a significant contributor to the film's overall lack of stakes. In the landscape of action thrillers, the villain often dictates the tone and the necessary ingenuity required of the hero. Hans Gruber was an intellectual predator, a man whose refined cruelty elevated McClane's low-tech defense into a battle of wits. Here, Komarov and his operatives serve as little more than heavily armed plot facilitators. They are obstacles to be smashed through, not mines to be outmaneuvered. This structural flaw means that McClane's victories feel less earned through cleverness and more like the inevitable result of superior firepower being deployed, even if that firepower is supposedly being used in opposition to the establishment. John McClane thrives when he is fighting a system that believes itself untouchable and intelligent. When the opposition is merely brutal and disorganized, his unique brand of defiant improvisation loses its necessary context. This narrative weakness is compounded by the way the film handles the father-son relationship under duress. While the script attempts to leverage the shared experience of trauma and secrecy, the bond between John and Jack remains fundamentally superficial. There is a crucial difference between forced proximity and genuine connection. In earlier films, McClane had moments where his external toughness cracked, revealing the desperate husband or father beneath, moments that allowed the audience to fully invest in his survival. In this installment, every potential moment of emotional reflection is bulldozed by the next major set piece. When they are forced to rely on each other during the precarious descent from the skyscraper, the emotion conveyed is one of professional necessity, not paternal reconciliation. Jack remains too much the professional operative, and John remains too much the world-weary action star, preventing the audience from believing that this shared near-death experience has healed years of emotional neglect. Moreover, the film seems oddly disconnected from the consequences of its own mayhem. The sheer volume of destruction, the tumbling vehicles, the collapsing infrastructure, the implied civilian casualties surrounding their high-speed maneuvers, is treated with a breezy disregard that cheapens the gravity of the situation. McClane's signature trait was his ability to absorb punishment and keep going, often visibly pained and exhausted, reinforcing the human cost of his heroism. In A Good Day to Die Hard, both he and Jack seem to possess an almost supernatural ability to shrug off impacts that should leave them severely incapacitated. This polished invulnerability signals a complete surrender to the spectacle over substance, transforming the grounded action hero into an untouchable superhero in a John McClane costume, ultimately betraying the very ethos that made the franchise enduring in the first place. The film's relentless pursuit of sheer spectacle leads to a peculiar kind of emotional sterility. John McClane's character arc in previous films was often defined by his reluctant acceptance of responsibility, a man simply trying to get home or save one person who then gets caught up in something far larger. Here, the responsibility is thrust upon him in the form of his son, yet the inherent drama of that paternal imperative is overshadowed by the budget allocated to vehicular carnage. Bruce Willis appears comfortable in the established skin of the cynical, world-weary hero, delivering the requisite grunts and sardonic asides, but the performance lacks the necessary edge of desperation. We never truly fear for John McClane in the way we did when he was crawling through ventilation shafts with a gun taped to his back. Instead, we wait to see which impossibly large object he will survive being crushed beneath next. Justin Long's Jack, as the CIA agent, is meant to embody the new generation of action hero, one who operates within established, highly funded parameters. However, this proficiency makes him a poor dramatic foil. True conflict arises when two opposing philosophies or skill sets clash meaningfully. Their conflict here boils down to John disliking secrets and Jack having secrets. This is a thin premise, especially when, within minutes of meeting, they are seamlessly executing coordinated assaults using military-grade weaponry. The film fails to exploit the inherent tension between the government operative who follows protocol and the rogue cop who instinctively breaks it. Instead, they fall into synchronicity too easily, suggesting that the script views their mutual survival as the only essential character development required. The set pieces, while undeniably large, feel detached from any spatial or logical constraints, which negates the classic die-hard tension. When the characters are involved in massive, prolonged highway chases where vehicles are flipped, abandoned, and then replaced by others without any perceptible pause for breathing or planning, the action ceases to be suspenseful and becomes a form of visual noise. It's akin to watching a destructive video reel rather than following a narrative strategy. The genius of the original was watching a highly intelligent man make the best use of a limited environment. This sequel revels in the freedom of an unlimited budget, treating Moscow like an infinitely regenerating playground. Even the resolution of the central plot, the nuclear materials, feels perfunctory. The villain, Komarov, is entirely forgettable because he exists purely to facilitate explosions, not to engage in psychological warfare with McClane. There is no moment where Komarov truly forces John to question his values or sacrifice a deeply held belief. He simply presents a physical threat that requires bigger guns and more crashes. The film's emotional payoff, the tentative rapprochement between father and son, is undercut by the preceding 2 hours of unbelievable survival. The audience is left with the impression that their bond was salvaged not through genuine understanding, but simply because they survived the software update to the franchise. The pervasive issue haunting this installment is the dilution of John McClane's core appeal, his underdog status. Throughout the earlier films, his victories were hard-won victories of attrition. Every bullet dodged, every bone broken, reminded the audience of the high physical cost of being John McClane. Here, however, both father and son operate with an almost supernatural level of functional invulnerability. They jump out of explosions, endure catastrophic vehicle rollovers, and sustain minimal visible injury, suggesting they have somehow absorbed the invincibility codes of a video game protagonist. This polished survivability robs the action of its necessary grit. When McClane is supposed to be the analog outsider battling overwhelming technological odds, his ability to instantly command and utilize advanced military hardware, like effectively piloting complicated vehicles during chases, makes him indistinguishable from the government-trained Jack, eliminating the crucial friction between their methodologies. The intended emotional core, the reconciliation between the emotionally distant father and the son he barely knows, is consistently undermined by the speed of the action. A meaningful reunion between two deeply estranged individuals requires space for awkwardness, tension, and genuine vulnerability. A Good Day to Die Hard allocates less than a minute for these necessary beats before hurling the characters into the next multi-million-dollar demolition derby. When John offers a gruff acknowledgement of Jack's competence, it feels unearned because we have witnessed zero reciprocal growth or introspection from either character outside the immediate necessity of survival. They bond over mutual damage inflicted on Moscow, not over shared emotional realization. The secrecy surrounding Jack's CIA work, intended to be the source of John's resentment, dissipates the moment Jack proves his capability in a firefight, resolving years of emotional distance with a single shared round of gunfire. Furthermore, the film suffers from a terminal lack of specific, memorable moments that stick with the viewer beyond the initial shock value. The iconic images from the original films, the tape on the back, the glass shard in the foot, the phone call confessions, were often small, claustrophobic details. This sequel substitutes these moments with broad, sweeping acts of mass destruction. The famous sequence involving the convoy attack utilizes an entire freeway system as a demolition zone, transforming the environment into a transient obstacle course rather than a dangerous, contained space. This excessive scale leads to a cognitive disconnect. The threats are so enormous, a collapsing structure, a massive vehicle pileup, that the audience stops focusing on the survival of the protagonist and starts focusing solely on the staggering financial cost of the visual effects. It becomes a detached viewing experience, where the audience is impressed by the spectacle but remains emotionally uninvolved in John McClane's plight. The film fails to understand that in action, cinema, sometimes less geography and more strategic limitations, create exponentially greater tension. The narrative framework built around the stolen nuclear secrets and the villain, Komarov, serves merely as scaffolding for destruction, entirely lacking the psychological complexity that elevated previous antagonists. Komarov is presented as a standard wealthy adversary with access to significant firepower, but he never develops the compelling personal motivation or the intellectual superiority needed to truly test John McClane. McClane excels when faced with a nemesis who understands the rules of engagement better than he does, forcing him into inventive, improvisational responses. In this context, the opposition is reduced to mere cannon fodder. easily dispatched by the combined yet superficially developed skills of father and son. Their eventual confrontation feels less like a climatic showdown stemming from character conflict and more like the necessary conclusion to a prolonged, high-budget demolition contract. This reliance on explosive externals prevents any meaningful exploration of the McClane family trauma. John McClane is defined by his difficulty connecting emotionally, a flaw that has cost him his marriage and strained his relationship with his children. The premise offers a perfect opportunity to force John to confront this legacy through Jack's covert life. However, the film never allows the tension of this conflict to breathe. John's anger over Jack's secrecy is voiced once or twice, usually while they are actively running from fire, and is immediately superseded by the need to cooperate against the common threat. There is no scene where John must choose between upholding his principles against government secrecy and protecting his son's life, which would have generated real dramatic weight. Instead, they achieve a fragile, temporary understanding based purely on shared survival, not shared emotional revelation, rendering their final familial truce hollow. Director John Moore's visual style leans heavily into hyperkinetic camera work that actively obscures tactical clarity. While previous installments allowed the audience to track McClane's movements, understanding his limited resources and proximity to danger, here the editing is so frantic that the audience is left disoriented. We see destruction, but we struggle to map how the protagonists achieved it or what their immediate objective is beyond moving to the next explosion zone. This kinetic overload is the film's substitute for genuine suspense. The feeling of being trapped, the cornerstone of the original film, is entirely absent. Moscow is too vast, too porous, offering endless escape routes and resources, which inherently lowers the perceived stakes for a character whose entire appeal rested on being cornered and forced to fight his way out, with nothing but sheer willpower and a cynical wit. The film mistakes maximum movement for maximum tension. The stylistic choice to place the action in Moscow, a massive, globally recognized city, inadvertently works against the claustrophobic tension that defined the franchise's success. John McClane thrives when he is trapped, when escape routes are sealed, and when the environment itself becomes an adversary. In the concrete and glass expanse of a foreign metropolis, where resources appear limitless and escape is always theoretically possible just around the next corner, the sense of immediate, suffocating danger dissolves. The sheer scale of destruction, the collapsing parking garages, the mid-air vehicle acrobatics, becomes normalized by its frequency, flattening the emotional impact. We are presented with spectacular ruin, but little sense of jeopardy for the characters who seem preternaturally skilled at surviving physics-defying events. This perceived invincibility extends to the characterization of Jack McClane. Justin Long plays him with a competent seriousness, yet the script never allows Jack to exhibit the necessary flawed humanity that would make him a believable counterpart or even a rival to his father. A truly compelling action pairing requires friction not just in dialogue, but in competence. John's scrappy ingenuity should clash with Jack's polished, procedure-bound training. Instead, they merge too swiftly into an interchangeable action unit. This lack of genuine philosophical or operational divergence robs their interactions of dramatic energy. When John inevitably breaks protocol, Jack rarely offers meaningful resistance rooted in his professional conviction. He simply adapts, signaling that the CIA operative role is merely a temporary costume Jack sheds to become another version of the resourceful McClane clone. The film's overarching tone suggests that the filmmakers mistook volume for depth. The relentless pace, engineered to maximize spectacle per minute, leaves no room for the audience to process the emotional fallout of the events. When John expresses concern over his son's life, it feels mandated by the script, not emerging organically from the shared crucible of experience. The moments where Willis historically excelled, the quiet grimace of pain, the dry humor delivered while bleeding, are fleeting, buried under layers of CGI and motion blur. He is playing the idea of John McClane rather than embodying the man worn down by years of extraordinary effort. This installment essentially functions as a maximalist audition for future action choreography, where the integrity of the enduring hero is sacrificed on the altar of bigger, louder set pieces that ultimately leave the viewer feeling exhausted rather than exhilarated by the survival of its protagonist. The film's reliance on kinetic overload over character economy ultimately hollows out the thematic resolution between John and Jack. The narrative positions John as the champion of the common man and genuine connection, pitted against Jack, the product of an impersonal, secretive government apparatus. This setup promises a deep exploration of how institutional secrecy poisons personal relationships, a theme potent enough to anchor a series installment. Yet, the conflict is resolved with startling speed and superficiality. The years of emotional distance, the palpable hurt John carries from his estranged status, are seemingly erased the moment Jack demonstrates he can successfully hijack a military transport or expertly shoot a cluster of nameless villains. There is no hard-won dialogue, no moment of quiet, agonizing confession, only the tacit agreement forged in the heat of shared, near-death experiences. This suggests the screenplay equates physical synchronization with emotional reconciliation, a dramatic shortcut that betrays the complexity the franchise occasionally hinted at. Furthermore, the international setting, intended perhaps to globalize McClane's struggle, paradoxically diminishes his unique skill set. John McClane's genius lay in understanding and manipulating contained, specific environments, the ventilation shafts, the specific layout of a building floor. Moscow, presented here as an unending series of broad avenues and massive, featureless structures, offers no such opportunities for nuanced problem-solving. The environment becomes disposable scenery rather than an active participant in the struggle. When John and Jack engage in combat, the solutions are rarely clever, they are overwhelmingly large. The audience witnesses acts of destruction that require institutional support, piloting military aircraft, coordinating massive vehicle assaults, which negates the appeal of watching a resourceful individual outwit overwhelming force. McClane, the ultimate outsider, is transformed into a temporary insider, granted immediate access to state-of-the-art military gear, which renders his supposed underdog status moot. The villain, Komarov, remains a cipher, a functional requirement rather than a genuine threat. He represents the impersonal nature of global corruption, which should, in theory, be the perfect ideological antagonist for the very personal McClane. However, because Komarov lacks any memorable philosophical anchor or engaging charisma, the conflict remains purely tactical: how to survive the next scheduled explosion. This failure to provide a compelling intellectual or psychological foil means that John McClane's inevitable triumph feels less like a victory over an opposing will and more like the completion of a mandatory checklist of action sequences. The film concludes with a sense of superficial resolution. Father and son are speaking again, but the underlying issues of trust, distance, and John's past failures as a father remain entirely unaddressed, swept under the rug by the final frame of debris settling over the Russian capital. The persistent reliance on explosive set pieces fundamentally alters the viewing experience, moving it away from suspenseful drama toward pure, unthinking spectacle. In previous iterations, the action sequences were carefully calibrated puzzles. Every gunshot, every precarious leap, had a defined consequence directly affecting McClane's immediate survival or the ticking clock of the plot. In A Good Day to Die Hard, the scale is so vast, so divorced from relatable human physics, that the audience becomes acclimatized to impossible odds. When a vehicle which has already sustained catastrophic damage plummets multiple stories and the occupants emerge with only minor discomfort, the stakes immediately flatline. This narrative indulgence in invulnerability creates a paradox. The higher the visual output, the lower the perceived danger for the protagonist. McClane's weary resilience, which was once fascinating because he kept fighting despite overwhelming pain, now feels like a passive requirement of his role, less a testament to spirit and more a footnote to the CGI budget. This issue is intrinsically tied to the underdevelopment of Jack McClane as a viable foil or partner. Justin Long, capable in roles requiring nervous intelligence, is stuck playing a character whose primary function is to prove he can handle military hardware as effectively as any professionally trained operative. The necessary dramatic tension, the clash between the cynical, rule-breaking cop and the disciplined CIA agent, is never allowed to mature. Instead of engaging in substantive conflict over methodology or morality, they fall into immediate, seamless cooperation. This premature harmony suggests the script viewed the father-son dynamic not as a source of internal conflict, but merely as a mechanism to justify deploying two highly trained action figures simultaneously. The emotional core of Estranged Family is thus reduced to a narrative convenience, something to be ticked off before the next demolition sequence commences. Furthermore, the film's visual language betrays the very character it attempts to service. Bruce Willis's performance relies heavily on the established rhythms of John McClane, the sarcasm masking fear, the determined, bruised gait. Yet when the camera is constantly in hypermotion, following vehicles in impossible trajectories, the nuances of Willis's performance are lost. The audience observes the effect of McClane's action, the resulting explosion, rather than tracking the process of his struggle. This aesthetic choice prioritizes disorientation over immersion. The original Die Hard succeeded because the audience felt trapped with John in Nakatomi Plaza. Here, the heroes are never trapped. They are simply navigating the world's largest, most expensive obstacle course, a concept that severely undermines the intrinsic appeal of the blue-collar everyman forced to rely on wit in confined spaces. The film feels less like a continuation of a character study and more like a highly destructive highlight reel manufactured for an audience conditioned to expect escalating, consequence-free chaos. The screenplay's desperate need to justify the escalating spectacle results in an absurd inflation of the threat posed by the Russian antagonist structure. Komarov, intended to be the high-stakes nuclear courier, is given no compelling personal stake in the conflict beyond vague financial motivation, rendering him a cardboard cutout whose primary purpose is to trigger the next major city block disintegration. In previous films, the villains were defined by their meticulous planning and their psychological connection, however twisted, to the hero. Gruber was an aesthetic rival, Simon a direct familial challenge. Komarov offers neither. He is simply another wealthy man with access to things that explode, meaning that John McClane's eventual triumph feels like sweeping up a predictable mess rather than defeating a formidable intellect. The film never grants Komarov a single moment of genuine menace that transcends mere access to heavy weaponry. This vacuum of meaningful opposition directly contributes to the emotional sterility surrounding the father-son dynamic. The film continually suggests that shared trauma is the fastest route to familial repair. When John and Jack survive an implausible sequence involving a collapsing building facade and an aerial escape, the immediate aftermath should be fraught with the unspoken weight of their relationship, perhaps a moment where John looks at his son and sees not a CIA operative, but the vulnerable child he abandoned emotionally. Instead, the script rushes past this potential depth. John's gruff acknowledgement of Jack's effectiveness, a barely mumbled compliment, is delivered while they are already moving toward the next objective, signaling that character development is an unwelcome delay to the scheduled destruction. The performance from Willis, too often leaning into established weary cynicism, rarely cracks to reveal the raw, paternal fear that might have grounded the action. Moreover, the film fundamentally misinterprets the nature of suspense by favoring scope over specificity. The sequences, particularly the infamous highway chase through downtown Moscow, are rendered so broadly and digitally polished that the audience is distanced. We are observing an event of mass casualty, not experiencing the perilous struggle of two men. McClane's defining characteristic was his ability to use his environment's limitations to his advantage. Here, the environment offers unlimited destructive potential, which the heroes exploit without hesitation or consequence. The film ends up suffocating the very character it seeks to celebrate. John McClane, the symbol of enduring, relatable resistance against impossible odds, is transformed into a proxy for unchecked blockbuster excess, leaving the audience with the memory of impressive debris patterns but zero emotional resonance regarding the fate of the man beneath the soot. The film's aesthetic choice to utilize a sprawling, open-world cityscape like Moscow instead of a tightly contained architectural maze effectively dismantles the foundational principle of Die Hard: entrapment. McClane's heroism was forged in the crucible of the inescapable, the sealed-off tower, the isolated airport runway, forcing him into direct, prolonged confrontation with his foes. In this sequel, the constant vehicular mobility and the seemingly infinite urban sprawl provide an easy avenue for evasion, which stunts the development of real suspense. When John and Jack are engaged in prolonged chases involving tanks and bulldozers, the environment isn't a hostile character, it's merely a vast, expensive target. This lack of genuine confinement means that every victory feels less like a hard-fought tactical success and more like winning a phase in a poorly designed video game where the map is too large and the boundaries too indistinct. The grit of improvisation is lost when the solution to every problem is simply to acquire a bigger, more powerful vehicle. This dilution of environmental tension parallels the lack of genuine friction between the father and son. Jack McClane, intended to represent the modern, sanitized government operative, never truly operates under a conflicting ideology that John can meaningfully challenge. Their disagreements are cosmetic. John hates secrets, Jack has them, but these ideological fissures are instantly bridged by the screenplay whenever the pyrotechnics demand teamwork. There is no moment where Jack must choose between a life-saving protocol and his father's desperate, instinctual plea, nor a moment where John must grapple with the necessity of covert actions in a world far more complex than the one he understood in the 80s. Their partnership snaps into place too readily, suggesting that the writers viewed the father-son label as sufficient emotional shorthand, avoiding the difficult, messy work of actual estranged reconciliation. Both actors default to performance modes, Willis to cynical detachment, Long to earnest competence, without ever truly selling the shared trauma of their fractured history. The action choreography itself substitutes coherent strategy with pure velocity. Director Moore favors camera movements that track the sheer speed of destruction, resulting in set pieces that are dizzying but ultimately meaningless. The sequence involving the multi-story vehicle transfer is the nadir of this trend. It's an act of visual hyperbole designed to elicit shock, not excitement. When the laws of inertia and human tolerance are so flagrantly ignored, the audience mentally checks out from the consequences. John McClane's defining physical trait was his agonizing, visible deterioration. He looked like he had been through hell. Here, both men emerge from cataclysms looking slightly disheveled but fundamentally unharmed, robbing their survival of its fundamental human pathos. They are not merely surviving, they are being magically reset between explosions, turning the film into a protracted demonstration of special effects, prowess rather than a compelling narrative about a man fighting for survival against impossible odds. Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the channel, The Territory of Cinema. Please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button if you enjoy our content. Today we are going to be discussing the 2013 film, A Good Day to Die Hard. The relentless pace of modern action cinema, that breathless rush of impossible stunts and barely plausible scenarios, finds a familiar, if slightly frayed, anchor in this continuation of the Die Hard saga. We open, as is often the case with the established John McClane, with him far from where he ought to be, this time finding himself in the neon-drenched, sprawling metropolis of Moscow. The setup is characteristically messy. McClane, the quintessential working-class New York cop perpetually out of his depth in foreign lands, is there searching for his estranged son, Jack. Jack, it turns out, is not just some wayward youth. He is, surprise of surprises, a CIA operative. This familial conflict, the grizzled veteran detective versus the highly trained, state-sanctioned operative, forms the core tension. Their relationship is clearly strained, burdened by years of distance and misunderstandings, a classic narrative shorthand for injecting emotional weight into explosive situations. Jack, whose career seems to have involved a great deal of shadowy intelligence work, is unexpectedly caught up in something far larger than a standard field operation. The immediate crisis erupts when a former high-ranking Russian official, Komarov, is being transported. Komarov possesses information vital to global security, information that a particularly ruthless faction of Russian power brokers desperately wants to silence. When the convoy transporting him comes under coordinated attack, Jack is forced to improvise, pulling McClane into the fray. This introduction of the elder McClane into his son's covert world is, naturally, met with extreme displeasure by Jack, who understands the protocols and the danger of having an unauthorized, unpredictable element, his father, involved. The subsequent action sequences reject subtlety in favor of sheer kinetic energy. We see massive vehicle chases through Moscow traffic, a sequence that pays homage to large-scale urban warfare films, but executed with the trademark, somewhat clumsy physicality McClane brings to every fight. McClane, whose career has always been defined by duct-taping improbable solutions together, views bureaucratic procedure as a suggestion, not a rule. His approach contrasts sharply with Jack's disciplined, often frustratingly controlled movements. Their initial cooperation is marked by mutual exasperation. McClane constantly undermines Jack's missions, often by sheer accident or by refusing to follow orders, a necessary evil, perhaps, for the audience who craves the familiar improvisational genius of the original films. Jack, meanwhile, is trying to extract Komarov while